Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Dalton. I am a travel and lifestyle photographer, and I make videos to teach you guys how to become the best photographer that you can be. So for those of you that are new here, welcome to the channel. For those of you that have been here before, you've seen me before, you might notice that I'm in a new place. We just moved into a brand new villa here in Bali. Well, it's not brand new, but it's new for us. We had to move out of the last one. And honestly, this one is pretty sick. And actually the room that I'm staying in is full of old antique cameras. The owner of the house collects them. And honestly, it's pretty cool to wake up in a room that's full of antique cameras. So anyways, today we're gonna be talking about something I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and that is why I don't think you should be shooting in full manual mode all the time. And on the flip side of that, why you also should never be shooting in full auto mode. There's a lot to talk about within that. We're gonna get into that real soon here. But before we do that, I just wanna let you guys know you can head to my website and download a free orange and teal preset pack. Not just one preset, I'm giving away 6 free presets for both Lightroom mobile and desktop, so you can use them wherever you want. So you guys can find a link to that in the description and check that out. But with that aside, let's start talking about manual mode and why I don't think you should be shooting in manual mode all the time. So first things first, what is manual mode? Manual mode is essentially a mode on our camera, designated by a little M, that allows us to control all 3 settings within the exposure triangle. Those 3 settings are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And the reason why that is important for us, the reason why we want to shoot in manual mode, is because all 3 of those things, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, they all have a unique effect on your image as well. They're not just affecting the amount of light that gets into the camera, affecting your exposure, but they're also doing something unique that gives your photo a very specific look. For example, shutter speed will regulate the amount of motion you can freeze in your photo. So with a fast shutter speed, you can freeze motion. With a slow shutter speed, you can blur motion. Aperture is going to control the depth of field in your image, so basically how blurry the background is beyond your main subject. And ISO is going to add digital noise into your photo, which honestly, it doesn't look very good. All you should know is that all 3 of these things that affect the exposure triangle, they also have their own unique effect on the image. So when we're shooting in manual mode, we can adjust all 3 of these settings, and that really gives us full creative control over the camera. It removes the camera as a barrier and allows us to capture whatever kind of image we have in our mind. That's why I always say you should learn manual mode, is because you really should have a good understanding of all 3 of these factors. However, manual mode isn't always practical. And honestly, I don't shoot in manual mode very often anymore, because I found that when I'm shooting in a high-paced situation where I'm moving around and shooting a lot in a lot of different lighting environments, shooting in manual mode just isn't practical, and I found that I'm missing shots. So what's the alternative then? What's the alternative to full manual mode? Well, I can tell you that it's definitely not full auto mode. You're basically throwing away all your creative control, and I never ever recommend shooting in auto mode because of that reason. So if you're not gonna be shooting in auto mode, well then what mode are you gonna be shooting in? Well, there's 2 that I always recommend shooting in, and that is aperture priority and shutter priority. So let's start with aperture priority. Aperture priority is designated by an A or an AV on your camera, depending on which camera manufacturer you have. And it basically allows us to choose the aperture of the camera, and the camera is going to choose the shutter speed and the ISO. Why is that great? Aperture is often the only setting that I'm really concerned about. If I'm not shooting motion and I'm not shooting at night, honestly, aperture is gonna have the biggest impact on my image, because it's going to dictate the depth of field in my image. For example, if I'm shooting a cup of coffee and I wanna make sure everything behind that cup of coffee is blurry, well, I wanna make sure my aperture is wide open, f1.4, f1.8, a really small number, because that's going to allow me to get nice and blurry bokeh in the background behind my main subject. Whereas if I was shooting at f12 or f16, the whole frame is gonna be in focus. The background's gonna be in focus, the coffee's gonna be in focus, and I just don't want that look. And with shutter speed, I can shoot that image at 1/4000th of a second, or I can shoot that image at 30 seconds. It's going to look the same. It's not going to change the way the image looks. Aperture is. So that's why I always recommend shooting in aperture priority mode. But there is something to note when you're shooting in aperture priority mode, and say for example, you're shooting in low light, your camera might slow your shutter speed down a little bit too much. You can actually go into your camera settings and set the minimum shutter speed that your camera will go to. I like to set mine at like 1/1 250th of a second, because then, no matter if my hands are shaking or there's a little bit of movement, the camera is gonna be able to freeze that motion, and it's not gonna be blurry because my hands are shaking. If it's super dark, I might go down to 1/60th of a second, but I don't really usually go below that, because if I'm shooting handheld, you don't wanna go below that because then your images are gonna be blurry. Shooting in aperture priority allows us to focus more on capturing good lighting and shooting a good composition, and less about which camera settings we need to adjust, because oftentimes aperture is going to have the biggest impact on our photo, like I said, and that's really the only one that we should be worrying about. Now, if you're shooting images in aperture priority and you find that they're too bright or too dark, then you can use a feature called exposure compensation. All cameras have this. This basically allows you to tell your camera if you want your image to be overexposed or underexposed. So your camera is doing all these little mathematical equations trying to figure out what a proper exposure is, but it's not always going to be right. So oftentimes I'm shooting at -1 stop on aperture priority, which means my images are going to be 1 stop darker than what the camera thinks a good exposure is. So if you don't know what that means, this is 1 stop of light in an image. So you can see on the left, this is a normally exposed image, and then on the right, this is the same image, but just -1 stop. So that's what 1 stop of light looks like. And I do this because I always want to make sure that my highlights are properly exposed. You can always pull up details in the shadows and editing, but it's hard to pull out details out of highlights if the highlights are blown out. So I always underexpose my images a little bit. Okay, but what if you're shooting motion? What if you're shooting sports, or you're shooting cars, or you're shooting something that's moving a lot? Well, aperture priority is probably not gonna work for you, because in those situations, shutter speed is more important than aperture. Shutter speed allows us to freeze or blur motion. And sports photographers, anybody that's shooting movement, they really need to have a lot of control over their shutter speed. So in these situations, you won't shoot in aperture priority, you'll shoot in shutter priority. And shutter priority is the same thing as aperture priority, except where you choose your aperture in aperture priority, you're choosing your shutter speed in shutter priority. So you choose the shutter speed and the camera chooses the other two settings. It chooses the aperture, it chooses the ISO. I don't think this is a good setting for most situations, but if you are shooting movement, then this is really a setting that is super, super useful. For example, if you're shooting cars and they're moving really fast and you wanna make sure those cars are frozen in motion, you wanna shoot at a shutter speed of like 1/2500th of a second. Whereas if you wanna do like a tracking shot and you wanna make sure that that car is in focus and everything around it is blurry, then you'll wanna shoot at like 1/40th of a second. So shutter speed is really important in those situations. But just know that when you're shooting in shutter priority, you can't control your depth of field because you can't control your aperture. So that is something to think about. You're gonna get that trade-off there. You're not gonna be able to control your aperture, but you are gonna be able to make sure that your shots are nice and crisp. One thing to note is both in aperture and shutter priority, you can still choose your ISO if you want to. So you can set your ISO to like 100 or 200, and then basically the camera will just adjust one setting instead of two. For example, if I'm shooting in aperture priority, I can set my ISO to 100, and then my camera is just going to choose my shutter speed. That's it. And that's good because you don't want your camera to shoot your ISO up when it doesn't need to. And usually it won't. It's not gonna do that. Cameras are pretty smart. But if it is doing that, you can just set your ISO and then the camera will set the shutter speed. You can do that in shutter priority as well. You can set the ISO and the camera will only select the aperture. So in short, while manual mode is useful, there's other modes on the camera that will allow you to be much more efficient in shooting and will allow you to really focus more on the situation, on posing your models, on nailing a perfect composition, instead of just sitting there fiddling with your settings, especially if you're not well versed in the settings yet, and you're still kind of learning, but you really want to capture these shots. Aperture priority and shutter priority are really good modes to do that. Okay, so I've talked about aperture and shutter priority. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Sean, why do we need to learn manual mode then if you're just telling us to shoot in aperture priority and shutter priority all the time? Well, honestly, manual mode is still super useful and I still use it in a lot of situations. For example, in low light situations, you really need to make sure your camera settings are super dialed in. So when I'm shooting in low light, I'm often shooting in manual mode. If I'm shooting a portrait shoot and everything is kind of slow, it's moving slowly, I'll often shoot in manual mode too because I want to make sure my settings are perfectly dialed in for those situations. But if I'm out on the street or if I'm shooting lifestyle, I will probably shoot in aperture priority because it just allows me to be much more efficient and focus on my scene as a whole instead of sitting there fiddling with my camera settings. Also, like I said earlier, everyone should learn manual mode because you really should have a really good understanding of all of those different settings and how they affect your image, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, because not only, like I said, are they affecting your exposure, but they also have their own unique effect on your image, and that is really, really important to know as a photographer. With that said, guys, that's about it. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below, what are you often shooting in? Are you shooting in manual mode? Are you shooting in aperture priority, shutter priority? What is your favorite mode on your camera? And also don't forget to go to my website and download my free orange and teal preset pack. I think you guys are gonna like that. It's super useful and installation is super easy. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.